You are back with the Sound of Ideas from 90.3. I'm Mike McIntyre. Last week, two Ohio lawmakers introduced a bill, the Save Women's Sports Act, that would prohibit transgender females from playing on high school and college sports teams that match their gender identity. The bill would apply to public and private schools that are part of the Ohio High School Athletic Association, as well as public and private colleges that are members of a state or national athletic association. Current OHSAA rules established in 2018 allow transgender girls to participate on girls' teams after completing a minimum of 1 year of medically supervised hormone treatment, or if medical evidence demonstrates that they don't possess physical or physiological advantages over girls the same age. Ohio joins a growing list of states seeking, through legislation, to ban transgender females from competing on girls' teams, including Tennessee, Georgia, Idaho, and Alabama. Proponents of such legislation say it's unfair for females to compete against transgender females who are born biologically male. Critics of these laws say they discriminate against transgender girls and women athletes and that they aren't backed by scientific evidence. So we'd love to know your thoughts. You can join our conversation by calling 866-578-0903. You can send email to soi@wcpn.org. You can tweet at us at Sound of Ideas. We're going to be learning a little bit more about this with the founder of an organization that's been pushing for this move across the country, and with a local advocate from the LGBT Center of Greater Cleveland, a transgender woman. We're going to start, though, by hearing a little bit about the genesis of the law being introduced in Ohio from State Representative Jena Powell. She's a Republican from Arcanum, and she's calling in to begin today's show. Very good to talk with you today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me today.
So let me ask, what do you believe the need is for such legislation in Ohio, given, as I just noted, the OHSAA has certain rules regarding this, as does the NCAA, which involves testosterone levels, etc. Why does Ohio need a law separate from this?
Absolutely. So to begin with, we believe that girls deserve to compete on a level playing field here in the state of Ohio. We believe that forcing female athletes to compete against biological males isn't fair and destroys their athletic opportunities. When we look to states around the United States that have similar rules that the OHSAA has, we see that biological males are ending up on the podium instead of females, which destroys female athletics in our state. So we want to do everything we can to protect female athletics, and this is one way to do so.
Do you have evidence that transgender women are winning more than people born biologically female? Because as I've done the reading, that doesn't seem to bear out across the country.
Yeah, so when we look to states like Connecticut, right now there's a large lawsuit going on in that state. There's a girl named Chelsea Mitchell. Chelsea was one of the top female sprinters in Connecticut, but she has been denied a state title 4 different times because the CIAC has allowed male athletes to compete against her. Last year, she had an unexpected chance to have a more fair playing field by a biological male kind of getting tossed out due to a false start. And Chelsea went on to compete and win at the state championships and the New England Regional Championships in that event. And this is something that's happening across the United States, where biological males are ending up on the podium instead of females. And whether it happens one time or 1,000 times, that robs the girl of her opportunity of achieving her dream of winning a gold medal in our state. That's why we're looking at this as it's a fairness issue for women, and whether it's one male or 1,000 males ending up on the podium, that robs the little girl of her dream.
I've noticed that you're referring to the competitors as males or biological males when they are transgender females. They identify as females. Do you not agree with the idea that someone can be a transgender female?
Regardless of what we choose to call them in this conversation, the main point of this bill is that it's a fairness issue for women. And what we know when we see biological males is that they have a physiological advantage over females. And those things include greater lung capacity, larger heart, higher red blood cell counts, stronger tendons and ligaments, greater muscle strength, and increased bone density. So that's really what we're looking at when we have biological males competing against females. And what we're looking at is this is a fairness issue for women across the board. And as a state rep, I want to do everything I can to help kind of keep female sports in the state of Ohio. And I talk to people across our state, and they agree. This is just a common sense piece of legislation because we all know that biological males have advantages in sports over over females, which is why we have Title IX and which is why we have female sports to begin with.
I've done some reading on this, and it seems as though not everyone is in agreement with that in terms of the science, the idea that all males or all transgender females who are born biologically male have these advantages. Dr. Nick Gordon from the American Board of Emergency Medicine says that transgender student athletes fall within a spectrum of physical traits found in athletes of their transitioned gender, allowing them to compete fairly and equitably. What about this disagreement with what you're saying, which is it's common sense, if you were born biologically male, then you have advantages, where there are others who are saying that isn't necessarily true, that there are many more factors that need to be considered?
I would say that's absolutely ridiculous. That's why this is a common sense piece of legislation. Everyone understands there's physiological and biological difference between biological males and females, which is why we have Title IX, which is why we have women's sports in and of itself. You can look at the science, you can see Olympic athletes, you can see state level athletes, and you can see the time difference between biological males and females. So that's where I would say that's ridiculous. And this bill is about a fairness issue for women, and we look at the time, we look at the numbers, we understand why we have women's sports. And in the state of Ohio, we need to preserve the beauty of women's sports so that women can end up on the podium. So that the little girl that dreams of going to the Olympics, of achieving her American dream in athletics in high school, can still do that today, tomorrow, and for the next 50 years.
That is State Representative Jena Powell, and thank you very much for letting us know why this legislation was introduced. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
We're going to continue our conversation now. We would love to have you join us at 866-578-0903. We've heard from one of the representatives who presented this legislation. We're now going to hear from Eliana Turan, who goes by Ellie now, and she is a development director for the LGBT Center of Greater Cleveland and a transgender woman. Very good to have you with us, Ellie.
It's a pleasure being here, and thank you for having me on.
Nice to talk with you. And Beth Stelzer is with us as well. She's the founder of the Save Women's Sports movement. She joins us by phone from Minnesota, and she's really been involved in this effort, trying to get these pieces of legislation introduced in a number of states and actually being successful about those legislation pieces being introduced. Very good to have you with us, Beth. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Ellie, you obviously have kept up with this legislative effort and the conversation about transgender women competing in women's sporting events and on women's and girls' teams. In many states, including Ohio and in the NCAA, as I mentioned earlier, there are various rules involving testosterone levels and length of time in hormone treatment and other benchmarks to allow transgender females to compete with cisgender females. This legislation is calling for an all-out ban of anyone born biologically male competing in women's sports. So what's your view on how this should be addressed? Is it there's a blanket ban? Should it be a blanket allowance? Or what about these various rules in Ohio and elsewhere that take into account testosterone levels or other kinds of medical situations?
Yeah, so I'd like to preface my response by saying a few things. First, I would like to quote from the medical literature regarding the term biologically male in reference to transgender women is wrong. Biological sex is an ambiguous word that has no scale and no meaning besides that which is related to some sex characteristics, primarily the outward appearance of one's reproductive organs when their sex is assigned at birth. It says nothing about our sense of self, nor our holistic physical characteristics throughout the course of our lifetimes. Most frequently, the term is used in a transphobic and derogatory manner to undermine the legitimacy of trans women while relying on a pseudoscientific facade. So, I'd please ask everyone on the show and all Clevelanders and Ohioans to please refrain from using derogatory language and hate speech on the radio.
Thank you.
Secondly,
apologize for that.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to set the ground rules here. So, my initial response, I have some very serious concerns right off the bat here. So, I went on the website for the so-called Save Women's Sports, and I've done some research regarding the lawsuit in Connecticut and the bill that's been put forward by the group called Citizens for Community Values here in Ohio. And there are some things that really concern me. First, the website for Save Women's Sports posted a video in which the founder references, in a very positive way, the Alliance Defending Freedom, otherwise known as ADF, which is largely driving the effort to ban trans athletes from competing safely in sports. The huge red flag here, which I think everyone should be aware of, is that the ADF is a certified hate group according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is the official tracker of hate groups in the U.S.
Ellie, I'd like to have a conversation and not have you read, if we could.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the original question that I had, and I want to get into all of these concerns you have with the group and everything else too, was that the conversation that's going on about the idea of having transgender women and girls compete in sports teams that match their gender identity is that they believe there's a belief that it's an unfair advantage, that it shouldn't happen, and there's a spectrum of ways that places are handling this. In Ohio, they're talking about banning it. In some places, you might say there should be no regulation at all. Ohio currently has, the High School Athletic Association, certain rules for how long you have to go through treatment. The NCAA has rules about what your testosterone level could be. Where do you see all that coming down in the conversation? What is your belief about transgender girls being able to participate, and should there be any kind of discussion about this science?
Well, I think, like all women, trans women come in a variety of shapes and sizes and bodies and appearances and athletic aptitudes, to try to define the athletic abilities of trans women versus cisgender women is divisive to women everywhere, and it's reductionist and ultimately meaningless, and it's just really a sounding board for various hate groups to strip the civil liberties away from trans people, which we fought so very hard for. And I think that it's a very dangerous concept. I think the decision as to criteria and guidelines for participation in athletics should be given to the governing bodies of the various sports in question and the medical community and science, rather than hate groups that have an anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, and anti-women's agenda.
Beth Stelzer, I wanted to ask you the question that I asked Jena Powell earlier, which is, do you believe that there's this common phrase that she's been using, and so have you, where you're referring to people who are transgender women who are competing as males? So do you simply not acknowledge transgender women and consider them men?
It's definitely not the fact that I don't acknowledge that transgender women as a phenomenon exist. It is the simple fact that transgender women are male. They are born with a Y chromosome. Sex is binary. It is not immutable.
And how did you get into the idea of being an advocate for this particular issue?
I'm an amateur power lifter and a mom, and I carved out time and the energy to finally gain the courage to enter the Minnesota State Women's Championships last year. And a male was denied entry and decided to disruptively protest the entire event. That led me down the transgender rabbit hole of figuring out all these different issues that we have to address. But girls are being forced to accept this ideology. They're losing opportunities, and they're not asked consent.
Is there, and I asked this earlier as well, is there evidence when we look across the sports spectrum? There are thousands of transgender women competing. We don't see the podiums dominated by transgender women. Doesn't that argue that, excuse me?
Yes, we haven't seen it yet. If we do not pass these laws, it will be no longer women's sports. It will be co-ed sports, and males will dominate the women's podiums.
Ellie?
The premise is preposterous. Trans women have been competing in sports, amateur, professional, and otherwise, for a very, very, very long time. There's no rationale whatsoever that suddenly our community is going to take over and take sports away from women. This is a ridiculous and preposterous fantasy that's based on fear, and it speaks more to the deteriorating civil rights environment in the United States of America that we're having a conversation, and trans people are having to defend our civil liberties against those who flagrantly use derogatory speech against us with the facade that this is somehow a scientific conversation. I should also say that trans people only represent 0.6% of the population, which makes it statistically impossible for us to take over in sports.
Let's have Matthew in Ohio City join our conversation now. Matthew, welcome. Thanks for calling in.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for taking my call. First of all, I want to say I am a member of the LGBT community, so this is not at all a political issue for me. But I'm a lifelong competitive swimmer, and I have a teammate from growing up who held state records here in Ohio at one point in men's swimming and is currently going through the process of transitioning from male to female. And I believe, knowing her and knowing this situation, my personal view on the issue is that we should take a more nuanced approach, and that athletes who begin transitioning from male to female before they begin going through puberty should absolutely be allowed to be competing as females. But athletes who begin the transition after male puberty has started, I think we should take it mainly on a case-by-case basis, but there should definitely be situations where those athletes should not be allowed to compete in women's sports.
Appreciate the phone call, Matthew. Ellie, what about that? And again, this gets to the science and the idea that it isn't a blanket situation, but I've heard this argument before that if it's prepubescent, then it isn't an issue. If it's post, then maybe perhaps there needs to be some sort of metric.
Well, these guidelines are already in place. So if you look at the various leagues and different sports around the country, governing bodies have worked with the medical community to formulate those guidelines, many of which are very similar to what the caller has just discussed. So we're not in a conversation about whether or not we should be addressing trans athletes on a case-by-case basis. This is already the case. What the conversation that's being had is that whether or not trans women should be banned in a blanket law that would prevent us from participating in athletics with our fellow female teammates. I think that participation in sports is a natural human right. It's a dignity. It's an opportunity to show one's natural talent and dedication and to find oneness with one's broader community. If trans people are going to have the opportunity to partake in public life, the ability to partake in sports safely is an absolute must, and the guidelines are already in place that allow us to do that. The conversation at hand is whether we should be stripped of those rights, and I fight against that.
We're going to take a couple of more phone calls here on this topic. William in South Euclid, you're on.
Hello, thank you for taking my call. I'm glad that you mentioned the state of Connecticut, which was that the two transgender females won state championships. But I also want to raise the issue of women competing in men's sports. There's online from the state of North Carolina. One of the state wrestling championships is female. Would the people be in favor of banning people from competing in the opposite sex of any sport? And I'll take my answers off the air.
William, thank you. Of course, we're not talking about opposite sex. We're talking about someone who is transgender female. But the legislation in this state and others don't address people who have transitioned to male. Beth, why not?
We do not see the same physical advantages that a female has over men that men have over women. So they are not seen as the same threat. And I would like to address that in these circumstances, these girls do not have the opportunities to wrestle in their own sex. Title IX has given them the opportunity in most cases to start developing these programs, but when these girls are competing and topping boys, it's because they don't have the opportunity to compete with women. So it's really not comparable. And I would like to take a step back and address what Ellie had to say about hate speech. And just because it is an opposing opinion does not make it hate speech. And what Ellie is asking us is compelled speech, and that's against our First Amendment.
Ellie?
I should not be judged on the validity of my movement by holding hands with alliances. I do not have to agree with everyone's opinions to come together on one thing. And I would like to note that the Southern Poverty Law Center is considered a hate group by some as well.
Okay, Ellie?
The Southern Poverty Law Center is the official tracker of hate groups in the United States. So if you are telling me that you have an affiliation with ADF, you should tell us this and be open about this fact. I don't think that having an affiliation with a hate group is ever acceptable. I don't think that being friends with the KKK or the skinheads or the ADF or any other hate group is ever acceptable. The Supreme Court has been very clear that hate speech is not a protected facet of the First Amendment.
Here's an email from Robert. He says, why can't they just make 4 different categories: men, women, trans female, trans male? Ellie?
So this just gets back into the whole separate but not equal thing. You know, the United States of America has a long, difficult, and often shameful history regarding segregation in sports. And usually segregation in sports is put forward by the power majority under the pretense of protecting the power minority, but it always results in the marginalization of the power minority. By putting trans women in a separate league, you would basically be saying, like, yeah, you're women, but not really. And this would be a very, very harmful thing to do to the trans community, particularly in a time when we are under assault physically, sexually, and socially on a variety of fronts, and we're actually pushed to the point of erasure due to the highly transphobic culture in the United States today.
Folks, this is a topic I think we could probably spend a lot more time on, and perhaps we will revisit, but we've come to the end of this part of the conversation. A takeaway, Beth, from you: you've heard the concerns from Ellie, who is a transgender female, the idea that the words you use have been hurtful, and you've defended them in saying, I don't mean them to be, but through this process, has there been any kind of a change in your thinking in terms of how you speak about transgender people?
No, I stand firm in the truth. Transgender women cannot change their male body into a woman's, and women deal with the female athlete triad, menstruation, pregnancy, menopause. These are all real realities that cannot dissolve. Women deserve fairness, and we deserve the choice to say no.
That is Beth Stelzer. She's the founder of Save Women, the Save Women Sports Movement. And a final thought from you, Ellie.
Well, I think that what you just said about women was very hurtful. I don't think that reductionist characteristics are the primary criterion for being a woman. You know, being a woman is a beautiful and complicated thing that cannot be reduced to terms like that. I think that women who don't go through menopause, you know, we're still women, you know, and that's true for trans women, that's true for cisgender women. We live in a time when the transphobia is getting so bad. You know, just the other day I read a story about a trans teenager who was pummeled nearly to death on a football field, and this is just days after the very brutal murder of a trans woman of color in Puerto Rico. We lost 26 trans people to homicide last year, and for a community that represents only 0.6% of the population, this is an epidemic. These laws that are being put in place that would strip us of our ability to partake in sports, to use the bathroom, to have equal protection under the law, to have equal protection in housing and employment and education and the ability to partake in public life are hurtful and wrong. We have the absolute right to compete alongside our cisgender teammates. And we're going to keep fighting for this because this is a right of ours, and we're not going to let that be taken away from us. And I think that we need to let women know as well that the premise of this argument is that women are somehow not as good as men in athletics, and I think that this undermines the entire women's movement in terms of the fight for equality in sports.
That's Eliana Turan. She is the Director of Development for the LGBT Center of Greater Cleveland. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Mike.
As well, Beth Stelzer, and we're going to take a break right now. After the break, we'll meet another startup kid, a 7th grader who makes and sells her own line of lip gloss. This is The Sound of Ideas. I'm Mike McIntyre. We'll be right back.